That should be good. For a second. All right. So curious, how many of you here have actually tried to vibe code? Has anybody used Copilot, Cursor? Wow, impressive. Impressive. Now, I would imagine if I asked a group of marketing people at a marketing meetup, there'd be probably 50% of the hands up as well. So that's kind of the scary world we live in. It's not just technical folks. It's not just developers. It's citizen developers that are now starting to merge. So it's a fascinating time to be here. Before I get started, I'll get you a minute if you want to scan the QR code. There will be a raffle giveaway of a lightsaber during the networking. I will move to the side, and if anybody needs to take that QR code scan, feel free to before we get into the more fun things here. That is a very cool lightsaber, though. Yeah. Sorry. Next time we'll have this QR code higher up. Did it work? Anybody still need some time? You could even just come up front and do it closer. It's a small group here. All right. Okay. All right. So, you know, what's going on around us? I think it's pretty evident to you all who've been kind of in and around software that over the last decade, we've been talking about how more and more code is not written by our developers, but assembled from open source. Except now there's an even more fascinating trend. All of the AI coding assistants are trained on open source software, and now they're producing more variants of open source software faster than ever. So you've got more people writing code in your organizations, agents making them write 10 times more code. And for those of you that raised your hands and said, you know, we've tried these coding assistants, I'm sure you've noticed that they're more verbose than you would typically write your code. So what you could write in 50 lines of code, the agents will probably take 500 lines of code and provide you a very nice, elaborate piece of code. Now, coming from Silicon Valley, I can't get away from a coffee shop to a restaurant to anywhere without people talking about AI. And like, I see these posts that scare me to death where somebody says, I created my new company in 3 days and built a whole product. Why do you think that's scary? One of them, quality, tech debt, architecture. It's like, am I really going to want to use a product? It's great to have a demo, by the way. Please don't get me wrong. Building demos in 24, 48 hours, demos before memos is a nice saying these days. I think it's fascinating, but it's extremely scary to think about this, that, you know, great, 95% of companies, code is being written by AI, but then you see this. Has anybody seen this post out in the wild? It's been shared quite commonly. So, you know, it's fascinating that the faster it is to write code, the faster you create more problems. Anybody want to guess what % of lines of code produced by AI are vulnerable? 80, 90, 60? Somebody said 60. Yeah. 60 is the right answer. 62% of lines of code. And here's the fun thing, right? I hear this all the time. Well, I just built this thing. You know what? I wanted to build a thing that just queried the database and built a leaderboard. Oh, you know, the engineering guys were saying it might take a month. I'm just going to go do it. And we did it. And guess what happened? We built it. AI was kind enough to write the SQL query into our database, but it missed all the foundational things from a security perspective. There was no auth. There was no kind of filtering in the queries. There was no rate limiting. And guess what we did, right? We let these interns deploy this code into production because nobody had time to do a code review. So we rubber stamped the code review. And awesome. Now there's this person who has access to this prompt. Guess what? Our little engineer over here decides to prompt and say, well, can I get out and get admin rights? Who here heard about the recent GitHub incident with GitHub's own Copilot on code, which was supposed to operate on public repos, and you prompt engineered it to go into private repos and disclose information? That's the world we live in, right? And so that happens. Now you got an attacker on the other side going, hell yeah, I got a way to break out of admin. Now I have full permissions of some agent that can autonomously go read everything off of my database. That's the world we live in. So kind of coming back, quantifying the problem a little bit before we start talking about, you know, where we see the opportunity. It's, look, Microsoft, Google, Meta, the CEOs are going out there and saying 30, 40% of our code today is generated with AI. And then crazy CEOs like me go to our teams and saying, WTF, if those guys can write 40% of lines of code with AI, why can't we? What we often miss is they're also the ones that are selling and pitching this technology to you. And when they go put this out, it's marketing. And we all take it, and our teams take it and run with it as truism, and we say, go, 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 and then you end up with that problem around security. So let's think about kind of what's happening in front of our eyes. And it's very difficult if you think about architectures and plans. You might have had a plan 6 months ago, and I bet you that plan around securing AI had no mention of MCP. MCP didn't exist 6 months ago. Who here is familiar with MCP? Who's heard about MCP? Anybody want to take a shot at maybe explain to the others what it is? It's fascinating. Yeah, it's like APIs. It's like APIs for agents. It's the new way agents can interact with other agents. All of a sudden, there's millions of MCP servers out in the world, and so now your problem is not even about how do I get this AI agent or technology secured. Now it's like they're all running wild, talking to each other with no authentication, well, limited authentication mechanisms. You're back 20 years on how they authenticate with each other. Authorization, access control, like you've got all fundamental security principles going wrong. But guess what? That's where the business is headed. So if you think about kind of what's been happening, a year ago, we were playing with chatbots, right? We were writing some of this code and playing around and having auto-completion. We've moved from auto-completion to assistants, or what I'd like to call pair programmers. At least the idea with Cursor and Copilot as they were built was they're pair programmers. And for those of you that have been following the recent announcements from Anthropic and Codex from OpenAI, now they're saying, you know what? Developers, turn on an agent. That agent will code for 8 hours. You go have your lunch, have your coffee, come back, and the code is ready. So you moved away from a pair programmer construct to don't worry about it, we got it, right? And if you think about this stuff, this is kind of where vibe coding is most dangerous, because you're leaving the supervision. There's an intern with a principal engineer. This is interns having no supervisors, right? So that's the reality we live in. I may travel back and be on a flight next Friday, and by the time I land, there might be a completely new paradigm even beyond this. It's very hard to predict what's going on. And so we should kind of maybe pair this and think about two things. If we want to, and by the way, we have no choice. As security practitioners, we have to embrace AI. I think with cloud, we were kind of cautious and resistant for longer with the adoption of cloud. I think with AI is going to come in and is already in your enterprises 10 times faster than you can, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So I think we have to get beyond we're going to put guardrails, we're going to restrict these apps from coming in. So I would say, like, let's start with the fundamentals. Like, let's secure the foundations of the AI that's coming into your environment. Anybody familiar with Hugging Face? Okay. What scares you about Hugging Face? Correct. So for those of you not familiar with Hugging Face, it's the new GitHub for models, right? And so what was the foundational principle of GitHub and how we got to open source? Open source is amazing. It's community. It's best effort. It's stuff out there. Now you have 1.2 million models, open source models out there, 30% more getting added quarter over quarter. And the idea is your developers are like, you know, that looks great, that lu.ma thing, that can do something, or there's DeepSeek, that can be even better and faster. What we have no idea about is how are these models trained? Can I trust the quality of the inputs? What were the inputs? What are the outputs? And what is it doing with my data? We have no idea, right? So if you are going to use this as a foundation to create AI systems of choice, it's fantastic. Just know that very little vetting has happened. So if you think about it, first things first, know the lineage of what you're using. Are you using foundational models? OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini. Look, there's an element of trust you can say with big tech. You know, we understand that. When you're picking up some person in a garage's model, you know, what do you think about that? So I think there's an element of discoverability there, like with everything else in security. Do we even know what models our developers are using? Your best place to do that is in code. You have discovering in your code, you probably need to have technologies and capabilities that are able to at least first tell you what models are in use. The next step would be, once you understand what these models are, is to start putting guardrails in place about, quality and controls and such. So we'll come to that. Origins of that data becomes really important. The other thing is really sandboxing, right? As you start building more agents, exposing more agents, what is the biggest problem with agents? It's kind of like, again, cloud and how you wanted to do role-based access controls and authentic. It is very those things those paradigms will get established. And most of your apps that I can guarantee you your developers are building are not thinking about foundational principles. So really bringing to the conversation either two choices. Either use sandboxes. I'll give you an example of how we built it. As we're building agents internally, we have very explicit container sandboxing to make sure the agent can't break out from one container system or one customer's data to another customer's data. These are very intentional choices we've built above and beyond what you would do with classic segmentation of data. So you have to pay more attention to things around that, around policing, around guardrails. If you can get that right, I also say what's really important is you need AI to combat AI. Meaning, a lot of you here are in the security team. We are almost always under budget, overworked, and understaffed. You are not going to get, unfortunately, more headcount to secure the 10 times more code that's going to come into your environment. So at some point, you have to say, if there are models and agents starting to write my code, I need models and agents that are trained to do my jobs with me, making it more effective. Right? You have to supercharge yourself. You can't eliminate your role. Nobody's eliminating your role. I want to just be cognizant of it. But there are things we can do here, and I'll talk about some ideas there in a few minutes. Let me ask you this. As you and your organizations are thinking about AI security, because I hear about this from everybody. What's your priority this year? AI security. I am curious, which of these two areas are your organizations and you as individuals most focused on today? The left to the right. I mean, how many of you are more focused on the left side today? Okay. Okay. How many of you are focused more on the right side? Fair enough. Fair enough. So yeah, I mean, I think one is about traceability, provenance, understanding. The other is kind of what I call trust, velocity, and scaling of your organizations. Okay. So here's a problem I mentioned, right? Like, you are not going to get as much headcount as you will gain developer velocity in most companies. So if you have 1,000 developers, those 1,000 developers now each have 10 interns. I don't know if you've heard about the new coding agents and what people are doing. They're not running one agent to write code. They're running cursor in 5 screens doing 5 different tasks. So that's what you're up against. So we fundamentally believe AI does not know how to write novel code, right? So essentially what AI is doing, it's been trained on open source, as we discussed. It's learned the good, it's learned the bad, it's learned the ugly. What is happening as such is it's replicating all of those insecure code patterns. That is essentially what's causing 62% of the code to now be vulnerable or issues. How many of you have heard about the new, I forget, there's a terminology for this, but AI recommends packages and libraries and dependencies to you that don't even exist? And it's a very real problem. Yeah, there's a specific package hallucination, but people have given it a term which is slipping my mind. But yes, it's hallucinating library versions, believe it or not, right? So what's happening there? As attackers are picking up on those patterns, somebody can go register a package with that name that is often hallucinated, and now you have malicious code being dropped into your environment. So that's kind of an example happening there. We find that AI does not, it's fascinating. Actually, I'm going to ask you to run an experiment when you go out on Cursor or Copilot or your favorite tool next time. Ask it to build you something the normal way, and then ask it again to build the same code, but give it very strict prompts and instructions on doing so securely. So you can say, follow the OWASP top 10 security best practices, avoid any injection issues, make sure everything has input sanitization, and you will see the same piece of code you asked it to build, just because you were more specific in your prompting, was actually generated differently and arguably better. So why am I saying that? Because when you think about an organization, how are you going to train 1,000 people to prompt very, very specifically to get specific outputs? It's impossible. It doesn't work, right? So we think, as I'm now talking about the second part for a moment, we think there's a couple of things. One is everything we think about in code and interdependency of code fundamentally shifts. So traditionally, you thought about code as first-party code and third-party code, right? So it was either directly written or it was a library imported. You now have multiple other classes of problems. When AI generates code, it is coming from some library, some version it was trained on, except it's not importing a library or a file. So how are you going to now trace the lineage and say, oh, well, this is code from log4j, or I am vulnerable to log4j. You might be running the code, you just have no idea. Example one. Example two is when you run software composition analysis scans, you are only looking for packages from NPM, PyPy, Maven Central, and such. Now you have to look for models from Hugging Face, actions from GitHub. All of that is bringing arbitrary code. So your scope of what you have to scan for and what you have to classify fundamentally changes. And so precision matters as you're doing that. Context matters a whole lot more. So if you have 10,000 code scanning vulnerabilities in a typical year reported by your applications, my belief is in the next 1 year, you're going to have 100,000 reported if you didn't do anything different. Why? Because of the volume of code and the problems it'll cause. Most of our programs on doing code remediation, code scanning, is held by Band-Aid and duct tape. And you kind of put more and more of this volume into it, it's just going to explode. So what we need to better do, contextual understanding. Why is that important? Anybody want to guess what percentage of lines of code in your repository actually never get used in your application? 40, 60, higher, 80, 88. So 88% of lines of code are there in your repository, but not used in your application. Why does this bloat happen? We bring in a dependency. Somebody wants to bring in the React library. Within that, they use 100 lines of code. 99,000 lines of code are actually never invoked. You bring an AWS SDK. You're only calling EC2 service. You're not calling the 99 other services. Code is there, not used. Flood of alerts because you have a theoretical vulnerability in that library, so on and so forth. So you're going to have to really start scoping these problems down pretty significantly because of the volume problem. And the last piece, I think as security practitioners, we need to start thinking about is moving from a reporting department. We often report, file JIRA tickets, send board reports on trending and all of the fancy stuff, but we don't fix, right? Fixing is technically somebody else's job. It's the engineering, it's the dev team. It goes in their backlog. And one is their backlogs are much more focused on AI and AI coding and everything else, so they're not getting to your stuff. But more importantly, when they get to your stuff, it's so hard for them to understand exactly what you need to know and understand if it's going to work or not, that those paradigms break down. So I challenge all of us as security practitioners in AppSec specifically with AI to say finding problems is not enough. We have to move towards fixing. And AI presents a fantastic opportunity for all of you, and with tooling, whether you're looking at tooling or processes, to really think about that. How can you solve the last mile problem? I'll give you an example. OpenAI is a customer of Endro Labs, so I often have conversations with them. The one AppSec engineer in a company with 1,000 software developers, the one AppSec engineer not only runs the tools, finds the problems, but actually goes and merges pull requests and tries to fix them as well. So that's kind of where modern programs are really starting to push. And I think you have a great opportunity with AI tools to start thinking about fixing, because they are quite good if you give them the very specific knowledge and guidance of what you need them to do to be able to do that. Okay. Models. I talked about the problems with the 1.2 million models coming out of Hugging Face. The scramble, I'll tell you, happened with DeepSeek. So many people came to me and said, well, I just want to block DeepSeek. It's like, okay, fine, we can write a policy that if somebody sees DeepSeek being pulled into your source code, we can block it. But what are you going to do about the 1.2 million other things? How do you know? How are you going to write static rules for, oh, I don't like this model, its lineage in China, but there's a lot more happening in the environment. How are you going to do that? So we went and talked to the Hugging Face founder, and we said, Clem, we think what you need to do is we can give you the what we do at Endor, actually just under the cover. We scan every model, we rank it against 150 score factors, and we give it a rating. And we say, Clem, like, we'll give you this data. Why don't you push it up into Hugging Face so your users, before they use a model, can see it? And they said, absolutely not. It goes against our principles of open, community, so on and so forth. So I share that story because we're at this very interesting crossroads, right? I had a conversation with the Anthropic founder, Manny Hart. And I said, Manny, like, you're talking about creating 10 times more code, having more citizen developers. What do you think about security? He's like, yeah, don't you have tools to run PR scans at GitHub? Like, yeah, keep doing that. And I'm like, that's not the point, because foundationally, we need to, as an industry, move to secure by default. Unfortunately, I'm the bearer of bad news to tell you that those companies that are now the hottest companies in the Valley or around the world on AI do not think that way. It's a logical thing, but they do not think that way, right? Their buyer, their users is a developer. Anything that is not about developer acceleration, OKRs, is not in their wheelhouse. So I share that because that means on all of us, the onus now is how do we put controls in place to trust but verify? And so using some kind of a scoring technology, there's tools out there that will do that assessment for you, that will be able to discover in your code base which models are being used, be able to do scoring against it, be able to write policies to say, look, I don't want models that have pickle files that are dangerous for whatever so and so reason. Super important, because I don't think your platforms are going to do this for you. A bit like cloud security, I think we all came to realization 8 years later, we all had to use a cloud security posture management tool because your cloud providers weren't going to cut it for you. So just start with that realization and your life will be much simpler. But here's a very interesting vector. Let me ask another question. How many of you in your companies do security code reviews? And so for those of you that raise your hands, how do you do it? Is it like, how do you decide which parts of the code base you're doing it on? Is it standard practice, everything that's a security code review, manual, automated? Like, maybe somebody can share. Yes. Yeah. That's smart. Yeah. Smart. Anybody else doing something similar or different with how you think about scaling code reviews, design reviews? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So the organizational aspects of
Yeah.
I've seen this done, not going to details of, but done in such a way that the security packages, they're expensive. They're only enabled during a certain phase. When you go production, when you're doing penetration testing,
yeah,
we run and only one person gets the license to use it. And then the software, as good as it can be, marks the different areas. Usually it's the authentication.
Sure, yeah.
Injection areas, and they sanitize, you mark those places. It'll create just X1 or 2, but it'll create vulnerability links. And
yeah.
Then every time you fix one of those,
whack them all. Yeah.
And then when that phase is finished, it's all clamped down. It's not part of the CI/CD. Part of CI/CD is fixed.
Sure.
And that's that are like
yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts. So here's actually an example, right? So you look at this, it's like benign, SAS passed, SCA passed, code owners fine, stuff like that, valid syntax. And it turns out it's as simple as missing authorization checks. So if there's one thing I can leave you with today, it's that traditionally when we think about application security projects and programs and initiatives, we think about the knowns. You have CWEs, SAS, CVEs, SCA, blocking and tackling. And that itself is a burdensome program, yada, yada, yada. The problem now with AI is your biggest issues are going to be architectural problems, like business logic problems. It's going to do stuff. It's going to create an API endpoint because you asked it to, and it follows none of your practices. It's going to create, it's going to change crypto libraries, authentication, authorization, stuff like that. And some of those things you can catch, the way you've defined, which is like, this is a critical service, so anything that changes in the service needs a review. But again, if code changes 10 times faster in that service, how do you scale that program? And so I fundamentally believe that is one of the best use cases for using AI to accelerate security work. And I'll give you a viewpoint on how we do this ourselves. So great, you use Cursor, you use Copilot, pick your favorite tool. Doesn't matter what you do. As soon as there's a PR, we have essentially trained 3 agents. One plays a role of basically a software developer, software architect, right? The other plays a security architect role. The third plays a threat researcher, security researcher role. And essentially, each one of these agents have specific tasks. The developer agent's task is to explain the intentionality of the code change. Because remember, us in security are not experts in the code base. When somebody says, can you review this? I don't know what this is in the context of everything else. So that's the one part of the person's job or agent's job. The second agent's job is to do an architectural review and essentially tell me, is it a net positive change or a negative change to the security architecture? Right? What are the things it's touching? Critical services, non-critical services. Is it a material change that then follows that paradigm of, well, then I need to get a human in the loop involved or not? And the third agent is basically doing threat modeling and review of the different classes of issues that a human expert reviewing the code would do this. And what you get out of this process is, let's say you have 1,000 pull requests and lots of code changes happening in your environment. Essentially, what it's allowed us to do is create a prioritization funnel to say, okay, out of the 1,000, what are the 10 that touched parts of the code, architecture changes that are actually interesting and material in nature to us? And then within those, you can then bring the human in the loop if you want to, which could be your team. You can ask questions of it. You can basically discuss, debate, deliberate. And then if you need to, you can kind of take that to the development team and say, we need to have a conversation on this. Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about where do you do this in the process? Ideally, you would do this at a PRD. You would do the design review phase and do the threat modeling there. But then we said, that is important, but how often is it that you have conference room conversations of what needs to be built, how it needs to be built securely, but the agents that are writing this code are not sitting in those meetings. They're not getting your full threat model as an input to go build stuff. So who knows what's going to happen? So we said the code that is the output of the entire process is probably, if I was to pick one thing to do, ideally across everything, if I was to pick one thing to do, I would do it there on the code, because that's the reality. That's the output from the coding and the vibing between the developer and the agents. And so essentially, this is actually what I now am finding. Most companies that are trying to think about in-application security, what are the use cases where I can scale up with AI, are starting to think about this a lot. So I am curious if any of you are experimenting with capability or architecture, trying to do tools, and yeah. From a code quality perspective, or do you kind of actually prompt it to do a lot of the security specific testing for you as well?
You don't do this professionally, I do this personally.
Yeah.
I wouldn't risk it for the business at this point.
Sure.
Still,
This is more vibe reviewing.
Yeah, well, that's the risk that someone then offsets their liability against
Yes.
the customer to an AI. So we haven't done anything with the risk.
Sure. Yeah. But, I think this is a paradigm that is going to be super important, because again, it's like in security, our job is to put guardrails for the business, right? You can't go in and say, don't use Cursor because I went to an event and this guy stood up in front and said 62% of the code is vulnerable. I mean, somebody's going to say, who cares? We still got to do it, because remember Microsoft said 40% of our code is written, so they can do it, we can do it. So essentially, I just leaving this as one of the ideas for you to think about ways you and your organizations can think about leveraging AI, either third-party tools. You don't have to build it yourself, right? Full disclosure, we built this for ourselves and then we started commercializing this. There are other players that do it too. But I think we have to look at workflow by workflow. And I can have a quick demo for you of how this manifests, and then I can show you where are some other opportunities I believe as application security teams. Oops, let me play this. So essentially, here's a pull request, right? Developer builds something. This is essentially what we manifest internally for our reviewers and for kind of our team. Essentially, is a summarization of what is the code change. What is the security risk across configuration, data, input, architecture, and essentially flagging the parts of the code base that we think are potentially areas of concern. And so now our reviewer, our code reviewer in engineering gets to see it, but also this feedback will go to the security engineering team to say, like, by the way, these changes are probably material. If you want to pay attention to, you should. So that's kind of the workflow. You could build it entirely in your developer workflow. You could build it out of band. It's a choice you make, but I wanted to kind of, sometimes a picture says 1,000 words, but that's essentially how we do it internally. All right, so what I'm going to leave you with is this kind of concept of ASA, if you like acronyms. It is not yet a Gartner acronym, so it might be, but I better file a trademark before that. So it's essentially, how do you think about AI security architectures? And I'll leave it in kind of just 3 boxes, right? In security, we like to kind of simplify things down, put some framework, some construct, which is define, design, and deploy, right? And in define, I think that's where most of us are in our companies, where we're kind of coming back and saying, whoa, 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 we don't know what hit us in our organization in the last 6 months. Step back. What is the governance? What are we trying to accomplish? Where do we want to enable AI? Where do we want to use it in production? Where do we want to experiment it? Where do we want to deploy it, right? And I think what you have to do in your define stage, it would be a mistake if you chose to bring in tools on multi-year contracts. I'll tell you that one thing, because everything is changing. In your define, I would also not define specific names of vendors and tools. GitHub Copilot was the hottest thing in town 9 months ago. My developers don't want to use it anymore. Everybody wants to use Cursor. And I almost guarantee you in 6 months from now, there'll be the next hot thing that is not Cursor. And so as you think about defining these programs, right, typically we'll say, well, the only authorized use is blah, blah, blah. It would be a mistake to be that granular. I think what you would want to say is really more guardrails. For classes of coding assistants, we should do this. For classes of LLMs from the ecosystem, these are the kinds of controls that are required. And intentionally just be a little abstract around that. So that would be my recommendation on the definition space. I would honestly take a page out of product management handbooks and really define this from less from a security governance perspective, but think about it as your company is your business and your customer, and how are you going to write and build a roadmap for your customers to adopt AI? I encourage us all to not write this as, here are all the things that can go wrong with AI, and that's why we should not use AI. I think you will be overrun very, very quickly with a policy statement that looks like that. So then kind of comes the design phase, right? This is where our engineering counterparts are already today. They're already off there. They're using tools. They're building stuff. And so I think the question really comes in is, how do you start thinking about instrumentation, right? How do you get an basic instrumentation to understand, okay, what are my engineers experimenting with? Are they actually even using Hugging Face? Maybe they're not. I don't need to worry about it. Maybe it's all foundational models and they're happy with it. So how do you kind of design some of the fundamental principles around these security architecture decisions? Are you going to use some kind of a scoring framework for models? What are you going to do when there's weird, wonky pickle files? Who's the SME who's going to review some of these models in your organization? So I would start designing the roadmap to the kind of where eventually this will be a production scale deployment. and really evaluate whatever those examples are. This is where I would take an example of what we just discussed is, can you do code reviews? Can you automate code reviews? Like, what are the guardrails that will work for your business eventually? And then on the deployment stage, I think this is kind of where the world is most fuzzy at the moment, which is, okay, Palo Alto Networks will say, come take my network firewall and it will take care of everything AI for you. And then CrowdStrike will tell you, don't worry, like, here's my endpoint and that's going to take care of everything for you. And so the world is a very fuzzy place for all of us to understand on the deployment. I would be very nimble on this front. And this is where I said, avoid long-term contracts, avoid vendor lock-in. Things are evolving very, very fast, but get the architectural components right. So, yes, you will need some instrumentation of code. Yes, you will need some kind of sandboxing for agents, right? So there are paradigms. Yes, you will need controls for MCP servers blindly talking to stuff and your data going everywhere. You will need a data loss prevention. Sadly, I hate to use DLP again, but sure, we could use a new terminology, data security posture management. But you'll need some of the classification capabilities to really understand what is your third, fourth, fifth party risk and how data is moving across these AI agents, because all of a sudden it's so easy for them to interact with each other and you have no idea from a lineage perspective where your data goes. So, I think you'll have this slide. This is kind of a framework to think about this model. But yeah, I would ultimately boil down all of your things to intentionally thinking about what is security for AI and what is AI for security, and pick one or two quick wins that you can deliver to the business, which kind of assert you as a enabler to the business, not a, hey, here comes the guys that are going to block us. So think about those strategies, need some quick wins. You're going to want to be in whatever that form of AI COE is, or experimentation teams are. You want to be on the inside, not be left outside the door, because keeping up going on there is going to be very difficult. So, I think we're going to all have to evolve our roles to be much more business enablers as it comes to AI. So with that, any questions, thoughts, ideas you want to share? Yes. So Endor Labs is basically a software security, or what you'd call a shift-left application security platform. Our main purpose is threefold for our customers. So typically customers use us in place of software composition analysis, SAST, secret scanning, anything that you typically did static code scanning around. And the way we have designed our product solves maybe the three main things I talked about. One is typically it is very aware of the fact that 88% of the code is not used. So the way we have built our underlying scanning technology will on average deliver 92% fewer alerts than, say, Sneak, since you mentioned Sneak. So the volume of alert, because of the fidelity of how we scan and understand your code graph, is fundamentally different. Second thing we do is we're kind of remediation first in terms of our approach. So what that means is, how many of you have struggled with getting, Java's like Spring library vulnerabilities remediated in past life, right? So it's easy for some regulation to say, well, if you have this thing, go fix the critical in 30 days. The reality in engineering is try to get them to upgrade from Spring 5 to Spring 6. It's a one-year exercise. So, what we have built is, because of that intimate knowledge of how you're interacting with all of these code bits and bytes, typically your answer would be, well, you got to upgrade. But what Endor will do is essentially not just give you the easiest alternatives to upgrade, but also backport security fixes to the legacy versions of libraries you're on. So you're not just forced to have a path that is very engineering heavy, but you can actually decouple the security fixes from all of the engineering impact that you want to do. The third main thing as it relates to all of this topic that we talked about is we have trained agents to autonomously work with Cursor, Copilot, and all of the coding agents to force them to write the code securely in the first place. So the legacy way would be, you generated code, you then scan it, you give the results to the developer, And now you defeated the whole purpose because you were trying to move fast with AI agents, but now you put the work back on engineers. What we do is we live inside of Cursor, inside of Copilot, and autonomously, as they are producing code, as I was telling you, we've trained these agents to play these different roles. They will tell Cursor, hey, you screwed up here. You introduced insecure code. Go rewrite it this way and use this alternate function. And we will basically make sure the code that the developer gets before they even check it in is secure by default. Yes? So, yeah, great question. So everything we have built around are actually built around foundation models. So in our case, we could tell you which version of Gemini, which version of OpenAI, other things we use. We also give architecturally our customers the option to bring their own agent keys. Because we use popular models, they can actually bring in. So the secret sauce for what we have built is in the intimate knowledge of the call graph of your code, on which we can then apply the intelligence from AI, versus in a normal case, if somebody just took your code and said, what are the problems, it would fumble. So it's the proprietary database that we have that's our superpower of security risks. We have a proprietary vulnerability database. That's our intellectual property. And so when we empower the agents to leverage that and then answer the specific tasks that we're asking them to do that we have trained them on, we get better outcomes. But as it relates to the model itself, if you don't trust our model, you can give us an API key to your model, and we can use that. So the models are interchangeable, and that gives the customer the control. But beyond that, the models are the foundation models. There's no black box of what model we use. I think the answer would be the same thing that happens to Salesforce or Microsoft or Veracode, which is like ultimately, if we get breached, the data that we have access to would be the problem area. So that kind of begs the question of, okay, where does your source code live? We do not copy your source code and store it in our cloud. So we scan your code wherever it lives. So if your code lives in a GitLab on-premise instance, we will run inside of your premise as a container, as a CI runner, and essentially scan your code there, make our determination, and then just keep our findings. So the worst case, if we are compromised, like any of the SaaS security technology you might use, the loss will be of the findings, the metadata, but not your intellectual property itself. Yes?
How do you guys go about vetting the security of like MCP servers? Because currently out there it's like the Wild Wild West.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Just plugging into it, but they don't actually. Do you have any process that you follow when using it?
Yeah, so we do not have a product in this space yet. We have intellectual property that is showing very promising results internally right now related to this. So I'll explain that. If you remember, like one of the things I said we do is we run 150-point inspection on any code on the internet, any models on Hugging Face, and essentially that proprietary risk database, what it's trying to do is tease out, is the code benign? Is there any malware? Are the developers malicious? Are there any signals of malicious code, malicious release processes, stuff like that? And essentially, MCP servers, as it turns out, is code, and 15,000 of them actually live on public GitHub repos. And so what we have found is that same exact architecture, because what it does is anytime there's a new Git repo, it goes, grabs the code, and runs it through this analysis engine. That's an internet scale engine that does it super fast across millions and millions of these things. Is MCP servers are nothing but open code that you call. And so we have figured out that our detection techniques apply there. Now what we are trying to do is figure out the paradigm of how would you want to implement it. Because now the problem is the MCP servers are a developer on their laptop could go connect an MCP server. Now how do I connect in there and intervene? And so I think we are working with the Cursors and Copilots of the world to think about how they think about standard control enforcement on their enterprise tiers. Because until they give you ability to say, at a global level, in my company, any developer that uses Cursor, we need to enforce these protocols, it's difficult. So I don't have an answer for you there, but yeah, malicious code detection patterns work on MCP as well. Cursor has just hired a good friend of mine. I don't know if he's made it public yet as a head of security. So if not, if they don't have it yet, they are building it right now. Yeah. Yes. Back. And you're not talking about deterministic security controls. You're just saying by nature AI is so non-deterministic that how do you even put security guardrails, which traditionally have required things to be black and white in many ways, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the problem is every week we're figuring out new attack patterns, new threat models, and that's kind of why I go back to we have to be so humble in the architecture proposals we make. What you write today will be obsolete in 3 months, and you have to just live with that. But no, unfortunately, I do not have in my crystal ball an idea of how you solve for that in particular. Um, I would say, like stepping back, this problem is not much different than how we think about the layers of security. You're going to have corporate users you have to secure via network or browser controls, right? So there you go there. You're going to need the data classification engines because you don't even know what data is getting pumped into different models. So like now you don't even know the data exfil problem. So if you pair it back, I would just pair it back to the foundational controls of network, data, application, endpoint, and then just start. Again, it's going to have to be multiple layers of control and not a single one, right? Like what is, ultimately you say, prompt injection. It's just another form of injection. Ultimately, you're trying to predict where this thing can falter. And so it's a lot like an application firewall from back in the day. But no, there's no good answer on the determinism or lack thereof in AI. No, I don't think we became lax. I just don't know the industry knew how fast this would all be ready and available for prime time. And I still don't know that we can predict. I feel like we're in the Craigslist era of AI. Like it's just stuff. We don't even know the applications that we can come out of in the next 24, 36 months. I don't even think we found the Apple iPhone of delivery of this stuff yet. So. Yeah. Yeah, logging is huge, huge. Yes. Yeah, if nothing else, just log everything. Yes. I don't think it's just that we whine a lot. It's just what we are measured on is foundationally at odds with what developers are measured on, right? And I think until OKRs align in companies where either engineers are measured on their performance and pay raises on the security efficacy of what they've built, they're not going to care. And until we are measured, and some of the CISOs now are changing where they are measured on not only how much did you reduce risk, but they are being measured by the board on how did you enable the business. So I think it's starting to happen at the top. It's not cascaded down in security, and it certainly hasn't cascaded in engineering and development. And so I think that puts specifically application security teams at odds. And then the stick we all have to walk around with is compliance, because you know what? That's true. Like somebody signed a contract that said you would have this SLA, and now it's your job to kind of, be the taskmaster to get things done. And again, that's what makes these things adversarial. I do believe those small things, like I said, like security, don't think about your job as a team of reporting. Like take ownership, right? How do you drive outcomes? How do you drive remediation? How do you take ownership of, like the OpenAI way I was giving you an example of, like yeah, let me come in and be a partner to you to fix, to architect, to do all of this versus just finding the bad news and reporting the bad news.
So when you mentioned
Prevention and fixing, yes.
surely then you've got conflicts against separation of duties. Do you think that should be slapped into the
I think you can still do it while maintaining separation of duties. So while, for example, with code, instead of saying, here's a Jira ticket, go figure out how to fix it. Hey, by the way, we've run the analysis. Here's the assessment output of, you have 3 paths to fix it. Here's the one path. And by the way, if you want to proceed with it, here's a pull request. It's ready. You're not committing the code. You're proposing them. You're taking them to the last mile. The architects, the engineers still get to own as part of their code ownership. But you have taken them a lot further, if you will.
I've got a couple of questions. Sequence one after the other. The question about roadmaps, yeah, the product you just I think something like this, how much per 10,000 PPU it has that, like, human architect or design or security expert probably see something coming when a pull request is made and like see miles away, like, oh, if you change this now, we're going to have a problem down the road with this on our roadmap. This, or even other things like we have some issue there, if we do this, we'll suddenly come. So
Sure.
something like that, how much
So there's 2 answers to it, right? The things you can train it more generically are generic industry practices. The way you kind of incorporate and make it more specific to your needs, one example is some companies have secure coding guidelines. What you can do is actually feed into this platform your secure coding guidelines so it can learn what you care about, meaning if part of that it says if you create an API endpoint, these are our specs of how it should be done. Now the system knows that when it's evaluating, it needs to think about that. It's just like, think about it as if you brought in a new hire into your company and you were going to put them through the basis of what you want them to know about what the development practices are, you can now feed a system to do it because agents learn and evolve. And that's kind of how this would work, right? So on day one, it's not perfect and specific to your company vis-a-vis yours. It has the generic best practices. Think a senior security architect has now landed in your company. Now you can give it more specific things you care about. Was there? Yes.
what's your favorite coding?
I mean, if it changes, it changes. I mean, I'm going to say Anthropic probably best. Yeah. So Sonnet is probably, we were doing 3.7 was pretty good, but now I know there's more since I've been on the road for the last few weeks. Yeah. So I haven't spent time on it. Well, 3.7 is as far as it had gone, but I'm sure it gets better. But at some point, things are better at a calculator, and you don't need the biggest model for. I also say, like, actually, I'll leave you with one thought that I think this industry we're not thinking about much is all the investors are making money on NVIDIA. Okay, so they take that money from NVIDIA, they pour it into Anthropic and all these big private companies. These big private companies, I mean, you think Cursor is making money selling you a license for $20 or $40? No. So it's like a drug. They're now all giving you drugs. But nobody in that ethos is making money. At some point, this old thing is going to crash and burn because we are doing things with AI because it's free for us to do that you don't even need AI for. So as security practitioners, I'll leave you with, there are some things better done with rules. Don't forget that. Don't get too carried away because all of this will at some day normalize. And suddenly you'll go from paying $20 to $2,000 to Cursor. And if you haven't seen, they already have now models that you're paying much higher price for. And I will tell you, none of these companies in the ethos are making money, right? So just be mindful, because you can go forward, things get costlier, and then the next model comes and they become cheaper. But like, find the minimal versus the latest thing that is baked and secure and gets your job done. And in security specifically, don't forget, the things that work with rules, work with rules. Leave them alone. You can augment stuff. Don't have to try to change everything for the sake of AI being cool, and you get a great performance review grade because you made something AI. It may not be good for your business long term. Thank you. Thank you. But I know there might be a couple more questions. We can continue the chat while we network. I don't know what else was next on your agenda. All right.
Next is just to say thank you very much again, and thank you, Verico, for hosting us. There
Yes.
is cold pizza at this point, but also cold beer.
Yeah,
Borrowing.
balance.
Yes, exactly. Thank you again. That was fabulous.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right.